Airbnbs, short-term rentals, we know exactly what they are. They're perfect for a weekend getaway or a staycation for two in the city. But over the past 2 weeks, there's been a little bit of a buzz about Airbnb, especially on a federal and policy level. It feels like that it may be the beginning of the end for Airbnb real estate in Canada. That's exactly what we're going to talk about in this video today. If you don't know who I am, my name is Gabriele Battista from Homes into Reality. I'm a Toronto real estate agent with the focus on educating first-time buyers and getting them into their first homes. So if that sounds like you and you want to get in contact with myself about becoming a future homeowner, in the description, my phone number and my email and a link to book a call with me are all there. Happy to reach out and touch base about your home buying dreams and goals. The Toronto scene right now for Airbnbs is fairly interesting for two ways. One, on the condo corporation level, and number two, on a policy level. But when you talk about Toronto condos, we'll talk about downtown condos, for example, the majority of condos already do not allow short-term rentals in their buildings. And that's according to the condo corporation rules and regulations, where they specifically will say we do not want short-term rentals less than, let's say, 6 months in our building. However, there are about a dozen or so buildings in Toronto that do allow short-term rentals in their building. Two condos that do allow Airbnbs would be something like the Maple Leaf Residence, 55 and 65 Bremner. That's the area where everyone cheers the Leafs and the Raptors on game days, so we can get a little bit busier there. And then you have 12 and 14 York Street, the ICE condos, which are famous for a different reason. A bit of a party reputation, a bit of a mess sometimes. Their reputation definitely has gotten poor with Airbnb, and it's kind of known for being that area where no one really wants to live when it comes to a long-term rental. Even though that there is condo corporations that do limit Airbnbs, and there are some that allow it, like I mentioned, it doesn't mean that there's not other limitations. Like, for example, on the policy level. For example, with the City of Toronto, you actually must register any short-term rental buildings that you are going to rent out, and there are some restrictions on that as well. For example, for you to be eligible to short-term rental your property, you must own that property, number one, and it must be your principal residence. And just by that alone, it kind of shows you maybe some of the loopholes that people are trying to pull when it comes to renting out different properties. Pretty confidently, I can kind of say, if you look at the majority of the downtown condos right now that are up on Airbnb, it's not people's principal residence. It's likely that it's an investment that they have or a condo they have no longer live in that they rent out full-time as an Airbnb. Property owners are also limited to only renting out their properties 180 days on these short-term rental websites. With the idea with this and the fact that it has to be your principal residence, they're allowing people to use short-term rentals on their own property, let's say if they travel a lot, or they're out of the town a lot, or they're not always living in their property. So that's what it's meant for. But the fact that there's so many units on Airbnb, you can tell that there are people who are cheating the system and are doing their best to just make a profit off Airbnb. So why do I even give this the time of day? Why am I even spending an effort on putting a video out on Airbnbs, how people cheat the system? Well, you know what, recently I can say that even in the past 2 weeks alone, I've heard more about Airbnb's restrictions in the last year. So there's been so much buzz around, there's so much smoke around it where I feel like there's something in the air where something's going to happen to Airbnb and potentially have a huge limitation across the whole country. The federal government is in a bit of a crunch right now because there's a housing crisis going on in not only Toronto, but in all of Canada, especially in your big metropolitan cities. And because of this housing crunch, they're finding ways on justifying creating more housing out there. And one of those ways is by eliminating short-term rentals with the idea to boost long-term rentals. Because when short-term rentals come off the market, new long-term rentals are going to come on the market with the idea that more supply may actually help out the prices of these long-term rentals. A really great example would be what happened in the COVID-19 pandemic when Airbnb essentially became non-existent. All these properties were no longer able to short-term rental these properties, and no one was really interested at that point on renting out properties on a short-term basis on Airbnb and such, because no one was traveling, everyone was inside. So a lot of these properties were thrown onto the long-term rental market and were turned into long-term rentals. So the supply of properties came up significantly. People were not moving as much, but prices of rentals have actually fell hundreds of dollars in many cases from that 2019 time to peak COVID, and then they've come back up since, which we'll talk about. Now, what I would argue is the issue is it may help in the short term, and it definitely will help in the short term. If more properties in the market and there's the same amount of tenants in them, looking for homes, prices will either stay the same or they will go down. It'll stop the busyness of the rental market because more is going to be out there. But because we have such a shortage of houses and shortage of condos out there on the rental market, I don't think it's going to have a long-term meaningful effect on keeping rents low. I think it's just a small band-aid fix on a long-term problem, and that problem being the fact of lack of properties out there. And it shows the fact that, rents really dropped down during the COVID pandemic with Airbnb and with a bunch of other factors, but they shot back up just as quickly once everything started opening up. People started to, let's say, put their long-term rentals back to short-term rentals. It was a bit of a short-term fix until people were able to find their new way around the system. Now, here's a scary thing. So people who are looking, who currently own short-term rentals, Airbnb properties, is the fact that the government really can get involved in really scary ways. And should they? That's one argument I'm not even going to touch. But in the sense of, well, you can use New York as an example, where essentially they are getting rid of Airbnb altogether. And imagine being able to operate an Airbnb in New York and everything's going well, your balance sheet looks good, your rent's consistently coming in, and all of a sudden, that's all gone. You're no longer allowed to operate Airbnbs in New York, and your income now goes to zero. And your expenses still are fairly high. You're paying a mortgage, you're paying maybe furniture costs or whatever that is, you're paying utilities, and you have to stop your business right away. The government can get involved and basically shut you down and say, nope, no longer, we are not interested in your business anymore. And New York had a very similar, I would say, problem or buzz in the air, where they were talking about they have a really clear shortage of housing in New York. And obviously, because New York rents are stupid expensive, they would talk about, housing is a shortage, and it's something that has to be solved. It's a very similar conversation we're having in Toronto and across Canada right now. So the fact that no one's mentioned an Airbnb ban, it doesn't mean it's not going to happen. And the fact that people want to buy a home and rely on that as their next investment, for me, is a very scary thing. And I've actually pushed many clients away from that short-term rental market. One other really important change that was announced actually very recently in the most recent fiscal update from the federal government was that the government will prohibit property owners from deducting expenses on short-term rentals in areas where those services are only limited by other levels of government, which would be Toronto as well. And Airbnbs definitely have some sort of expense. There's property management, there's cleaners, there's things that cost money in operating Airbnb. So if Airbnb owners are no longer able to deduct those expenses from the income that they earn, it definitely will make it less attractive to be an Airbnb owner in these major cities. Here's the harsh reality. We're in one of the biggest housing crises, especially on a rental affordability end, that Canadians have ever seen. And the federal government is going to do whatever they can, good PR, to make sure that they're seen in a good light. And if by banning Airbnb, even though it may not really be a long-term solution to making rents more affordable, if they're going to have to do that to make sure that they can get some good PR and good people will look kindly on them, they're going to do it. So if you have an Airbnb right now and you think of changing it to a long-term rental, you may think, oh, let's do it right away, let's get it done. There's one thing that I saw on Twitter I wanted to share, and I'll put it up here and I'll read it exactly. It's from the Canadian tax guy, really great follow on Twitter. He's a gentleman who knows his tax law very well, much better than me. But he reads, short-term rental properties are not treated the same as rental properties. There is so little understanding about tax for short-term rental properties that there's so many key details. This is how you can lose $100K on an Airbnb. Short-term rental properties are generally treated as commercial properties instead of residential rental income. There's a ton of implications to this. The major implication is that you have to self-assess the HST, which is 13% in Ontario, if you convert your short-term rental property to a rental property. So the really good example that he gives is, let's say 2 years ago, you buy a property for $1 million in Ontario and use it for a short-term rental. And then because of these new rules, you decide, you know what, I don't like the government getting involved in my property, and you want to put it to a long-term rental. You get one tenant for a long time. What you may have to do is self-assess your HST, meaning that you essentially have to charge yourself HST on the value of the property and pay that to the CRA. So on $1 million property, it's $130,000 that you owe to the government. That's enough of me talking about Airbnb, at least for the year. I won't do it again. If you have any comments or thoughts on what that means for you, or what do you think your thoughts about banning Airbnb? You think it's a good idea, a bad idea, or it really doesn't matter? Let me know in the comments. Like, subscribe to the video. Every single week we post content for first-time buyers getting into the Toronto real estate market and helping them understand the real estate market as a whole in a better way. Thank you so much. Reach out below. Talk soon.